Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from sunny, beautiful Mount Soma today, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Today we're doing something a little different. Somebody made a request. They made a comment to the blogs, which I appreciate. I'm hoping people start sending in more comments at michaelmamas.net. You can comment on the blog and the podcast. That used to be, remember, Scotty? That used to be like the most interactive part of my blogging. I used to write blogs, not do podcasts, and then we would just go back and forth, and people would comment, and I'd respond, and it was a lot of fun. And I think it brought out a lot of good stuff. I know it did. So hopefully we'll start doing something like that. But what I'm going to do, the way I do these podcasts, is I have a thought and I jot it down, just enough to trigger the thought. Not even a full sentence. And then another thought and jot it, and before you know it, I get a list. Now, for this particular podcast, the list is really long. Usually, it's quite short, but then I used to just read over it real quickly before the podcast and do my podcast. Well, I'm going to still do all that, except that now I'm going to also post those notes instead of just deleting them after the podcast. And we'll see how it goes. And all these fragmented thoughts, but I was thinking about it, a couple things. One is you read a whole book and then you ask somebody, what was it about? And then 2 or 3 sentences, boom, you get the book, and that's enough, right, Scotty? Do you know what I'm talking about?
We were just talking about stuff like that, but in a
nutshell. Really? Yeah. And the other thing is that triggered all of this is voice recognition. Before I was using voice recognition for my
sort of like
text is what I was looking for my texts or my emails. I would just type it out and check all the typos and be very careful and have it all right. But with voice recognition, you just talk a little bit and then you hit send. And you've done that, Scotty. I remember when I first, you were the one that inspired me to start doing that, because I remember I'd get texts from you, Scotty, and it was like, well, what is this? And can this guy not spell? You know what I mean? And then I realized you were doing voice recognition, but the point was I got it. I understood what you were saying.
Yeah.
And it's so much more, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
To write in text, just have it be voice recognition. So I started thinking, well, now I think we're on to something here, because between the voice recognition and just in a nutshell, in a word, instead of reading the whole book, kind of a concept, you get the gist of it. And in a way, it's even better, because if it's just, you're not kind of like grabbing a hold of the person's mind and forcing them to think a certain way. You're just giving them a seed form of something to think about, and then they can reflect on it. And so we're going to try that, because I remember when I used to write blogs, I'd be very careful about proper grammar and spelling and restructuring and we're not going to do any of that. And let's see how it goes, And again, I really hope you make comments, not only on the things that we say in the podcast or the things that we write in these, little thought fragment blogs. So you can comment, if you would, about the format. Is it okay to blog that way? And also any thoughts that it triggers for you that you want to discuss about the podcast or what have you. And we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So the title of this podcast, this blog, is Wisdom of the Seers, How to Properly Toss a Thought Salad. And then it says narrative popcorn and the Jaimini Sutras, on the other hand. Okay, the Jaimini Sutras, the whole Veda is so fascinating. And the more you get into it, and the more you start to understand the structure of it and understand, what it is. I mean, it's like the nature of existence. It's all done with mirrors. At any rate, the Jaimini Sutras are part of the Upangas, and pretty much I think everybody more or less has heard of Vedanta. Vedanta is like the highest knowledge of the Upangas. It culminates in Vedanta, the Upangas progression, the different systems of Indian philosophy, if you will. But the Jaimini Sutras, they're called the Karma Mimamsa Sutras of Jaimini. It's about karma. It's about action, and the way it's structured, the way it's generally translated and read, how you read it is basically how to perform a ceremony, how to properly perform a yajna. It's called or any Vedic ceremony. And what is the expanded meaning of the word yajna? It's action that facilitates evolution. You could say it that way. And of course, there are various degrees of proper performance, of any ceremony. You can do it right, you can do it wrong, you can get it 90% right, whatever. But now in the Jaimini Sutras, it talks about, how to properly do it, and what's properly mean? In harmony with nature, Mother Nature, the Veda. And so you could read it on one level like rules to follow, and that's the whole Upaveda. It's all about the Shastras that are called the rules. But really, rules is not quite the right word, to describe what the Shastras are, because I guess it's a little bit like you could look at the Jaimini Sutras, you could look at the Upaveda all the way through to Vedanta. You could look at it as kind of like, if just give you a feel for it, if God was watching human beings evolve and giving his guidance, his support, his suggestion, or however you want to say it. That's what the Upangas are. And so it's like, think of yourself like, okay, I'm a father. So for me, it would be like when the father is advising one of his children. You can do it one way and say, okay, this rule, follow this rule, follow this rule, follow this. And it's not going to work as well as if you talk to them and give them a feeling and kind of help them find the truth of everything within their own being, And so even though the Shastras, there are clearly prescribed rules in that, but really the underlying motivation of them, you could say, I guess, is that it cultivates in the awareness of the child, of the person, of the human being, a means of signposts, assistance, guidelines, guidance, so that they can more and more fully find, divinity, truth, proper conduct, whatever, within their own self, you see. So now, specifically the Jaimini Sutras, there's one particular chapter in it that's really intriguing and I think really important. And in that chapter in the Jaimini Sutras, it says, okay, when you're doing a particular ceremony, you do this. But then it says, on the other hand, not so, by reason of, and it gives some reason, and then it says, and so therefore do this. And so it's kind of, the whole thing's kind of riddled with contradiction. And on the one hand, and really the best way to do the Jaimini, to listen to Jaimini Sutras then, or to do Jaimini Sutras, isn't to sit there and try to analyze, well, what the heck is he talking about? I mean, you could do that, but the other way is just to kind of listen to it when you're really, deep, even right after meditation is good, because you're settled. And what that starts to do is it cultivates in you an awareness of the paradoxical nature of life and how it resolves, more importantly, I guess you'd say, how it resolves in Vedanta. Vedanta is that place where everything unifies, everything is one. it transcends, you see, the field of action, the paradoxical nature of karma, and brings it all together into a unified whole. Okay? And so that understanding, it can sound really abstract, and okay, why are we getting into all this abstract theory about the structure of the Veda and that? But here's the thing: life, politics, get into any subject, gun control, the border. You can give a reason why, like, for example, get rid of the border. Why? Because let's become a global community. On the other hand, if you do that, then a bunch of terrorists and drugs and everything are going to flood in, so you can't do it. So you see, these fundamental principles within the structure of Veda, specifically now we're talking about Jaimini Sutras, they well up through all levels of life. Now, of course, within the structure of Jaimini Sutra itself, on its deepest level, it's the unification of paradoxical natures that neither is wrong. It's just the nature of existence is paradoxical. On the surface of life, it's not that way, is it? I mean, you can just be plain wrong, Of course, when individuals are functioning, they're really coming from that Vedantic place, that deepest level. And so what they do is they take one of these perspectives and grab onto it and then get mad or judgmental of the other perspective, even if there is truth in the other perspective, you see? And so what that comes to, and why this is so important, is it gives us a feeling of how to navigate the conflicting narratives of life. And what does that do? It cultivates wisdom. And boy, I mean, in this world today, with the internet, and also with cable TV, where there's so many different channels, and you go to one news station and they're giving one narrative, and you go to another news station, they're giving a contradictory narrative, and they're arguing back and forth. And just recently, when Biden gave his speech about gun control, I mean, I thought he made some really beautiful points. I did. And but then if you watch a conservative commentary, they just rip the whole thing apart. Well, I think he had some good points. At the same time, the contradictory perspective had great points too. So how do you navigate that? How do you deal with it? And also, even in life, I mean, I think a lot of people, for example, might look at the whole Vedic thing and say, oh, well, that's just another religion, and the people in Tahiti from the ancient times, or the natives in Africa, that you just read about or whatever. That's all just different religious narratives, And so you kind of pick and choose and go with the one that you have an affinity for, that you've been, I was going to say indoctrinated into, that's a little harsh, but the one that you've been convinced of for whatever reason, and reject the others. It becomes a very different thing when you can find the truth in a narrative without, getting out of balance with the whole thing. And also when you can start to see past the narratives you've been indoctrinated into, and that is a far subtler art than, one may think. Another factor that comes into play is your cultural background, how your being has been cultured, and it creates a life path. A healthy culture cultures the awareness of the people so they evolve more quickly. And so it's not about, just purely intellectual, oh, well, I saw this one guy on the news once. I don't know why this came to mind. I should probably come up with a different subject. But he said, well, I'm just not inhibited. And he says, that's why I feel perfectly comfortable walking around naked in public. And I mean, talking about an intellectual narrative that's just not consistent with the culture, and anyway, this is kind of the arena we're in here. Scotty, you got anything to say about all that?
No, the other day I played golf for the first time in a long time,
Huh.
and I used to play a lot, but I used to use some of these principles, oddly enough, on something I guess is as trivial as golf. But it's funny because when you're hitting certain shots, like you're on the first tee and you're hitting the driver, you got to swing it, a certain speed. But when you get near the green and you're chipping, I used to use the principle to, like, if I hit this super soft, how far will it go? If I hit this full swing, where will it go? And then
Yeah.
I would use it, say, those aren't quite right, right? And then I would get the feel, but then I would involve the feeling of, okay, if I do this just right, neither one of them would have hurt me. They would have just run the score up. You know what I mean? It's like you can pick either one, but if you pick the right one, it helps you. You know what I mean? Like,
So how does that apply?
so I'm just saying in terms of working with this thing. So it applies like, like you were talking about the gun control thing. If I listen to this wholeheartedly, that that that's one thing. Yeah, I can grab onto that narrative. If I go to this other narrative, I can hold. Or is the answer lie somewhere in between these things? Do I
Yeah, I
take
get you.
certain things and it's the same thing with the swing. If I swing too soft, the ball goes 2 inches. If I swing too hard, the ball goes 300 yards. Well, I'm on the
Yeah.
green, but I only needed to go 13 feet. So I
And so
take,
you've got two perspectives here, and
right,
and how do you resolve it? It's in the feelings, but it's
right,
feelings. See, and it's a good point, Scotty, because the feelings aren't determined by a narrative or
right.
identity with a narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah, if we cling on to the fact with respect to the border that well, we should be global, or if we cling on to the fact, well, if we don't have a strong border, terrorists will come across. Uh, uh, then we lose our balance, really.
sure.
And so, on all these different issues, even how to swing the golf club, it's about feeling into the depth
Yep,
without letting your feelings get overwhelmed with passionate feelings that are based on an identity that you've been convinced of.
right.
You
Yeah,
know, and it blows my mind. You watch the news, you go from one narrator or one
yeah,
news broadcaster to the next, and they're all about strong identity with a narrative,
right,
passionate identity, pushing their narrative. And I mean, nobody wants to get a narrative shoved down their throat, you know?
right.
Uh, it's just not the way it should work. Wisdom isn't about narrative identity, though it's certainly there are times when through wisdom you will align with a particular narrative,
Yeah.
but
Well, it seems like also, I was listening to. There's a couple of news agencies that are kind of try to show you the full spectrum. They're on YouTube or whoever, whatever sources, and they were
yeah,
talking about the CNN and the Fox, and how Fox is really winning the war of ratings where CNN is not, because they're really driving that narrative where Fox is at least trying to bring on different, they have the right wing and they also have the left wing and good representatives of the left wing.
yeah, but I think Fox is still pretty slanted one way.
Yeah, of course, yeah, but at
Yeah,
least
okay.
they're
I see.
trying more than the others.
Yeah.
So, and because they're saying that, like, CNN's just, their ratings are just terrible because they're not doing that. You know?
What I do is I believe in watching the news.
Yeah,
I think it's so many people vote and they don't even know who won the Civil War or what anything.
yeah,
And and I think that has to do with current events too. So what I do is there's this one program on MSNBC. It's very liberal, but I watch it, and then I watch something on Fox, then I watch something on Newsmax,
yeah,
and I try to understand, not overstand, but humbly, listen to each, and then find within my own self what I believe. Sometimes it's not hard at all. Other times, it takes reflection. But
yeah,
now here's the thing too: the legal system. I have a friend, an acquaintance who's an attorney, and I told him once. I said, the law and justice have nothing to do with each other. And even the way it's structured, the law, there's a bunch of laws and loopholes, and this happens this way because of this law, and it really has nothing to do with the justice of the situation. It's just a law that was created. And the whole approach, you got opposing sides, and one is forcing one narrative, the other is forcing the other narrative. And it's not about pursuing truth, it's about winning. And another attorney I know, he said an interesting thing once. He said hearings are decided, court cases are decided before the court even starts to happen. It's decided in the jury selection. And I think a strong example of that, what is this guy's name now who was just that hearing that was on the news in Washington, D.C., and he was an attorney for Hillary Clinton that was pushing the whole narrative about Trump was colluding with the Russians. And the whole subject, if you listen to these attorneys talk about the thing, it was really about the jurors. And they're all Clinton supporters. Almost everybody in Washington, D.C. voted for Clinton. And so they really didn't think, regardless of what evidence came about, that there'd be any judgment that they'd come up with other than in favor of Clinton's attorney. And that is, in fact, the way it turned out. So really, in a sense, they talk about, justice is, the blindfold and all, and the scales, and, everybody's equal type thing. But really, I think justice is blind in the sense that it's blind to the facts. It's more about the bias of the jurors. And if there's a judge, I mean, even the Supreme Court, how many decisions are made 5-4 votes? And how each side's going to vote based on their political affiliations. Where is the justice in that, So the whole thing is just crazy, and so how do we resolve all that? How do we get past all that? More evolved people that live with a deep understanding and communion with the depth of understanding of the Jaimini Sutras and how it resolves into Vedanta, and living that level of life. And that's what's got to happen, and that's, again, not to beat that drum too much, but that's what Mount Soma is all about. What Soma is? Soma, I like to say Mount Soma is a mountain of Soma. Soma is like, they talk about it, nectar of the gods. Soma is it's actually a chemical that when the physiology is really refined and really purified and functioning in real harmony with the laws of nature, in harmony with, Jaimini Sutras, in harmony with Vedanta, you could say, the more in harmony with it is, the physiology starts producing, and the stomach actually starts producing Soma. And Soma is a nectar of the gods. It feeds health. It feeds clarity of perception, all like that. So that's why Mount Soma, that's what we're doing here. We're building this unified field generator, and what's it going to do? It's going to radiate out that level of life, inducing the environment to live more from a place of refinement, Soma,
Well, Michael, that's one of the things that I was thinking of when I saw that with it wasn't about the CNN or the Fox or anything. It's just about people are more, it made me feel good because it seems like people are awakening to that now too, where it's like, I can't just be in this camp or this camp, because if I stick with this camp, it doesn't work. I've got to.
Yeah, there's no question about that, Scotty. And I think what happened is the whole thing got overplayed. It got too nutty, and people are saying, "Hey, the emperor has no clothes here. Let's wake up." And we talked about this. I don't know if I mentioned this in a podcast or not. I think you and I were talking about this, Scotty, over the phone, and that is that this whole thing of this hyper progressive mentality. If you just trace it, and there are books about this. It actually started in Germany, I think, over 100 years ago, and it was kind of a Marxist philosophy, and it came, I think, over to the United States. I think around 1920, and I think it went to Columbia University, or it was NYU. I think it was Columbia, so it started infiltrating from there this kind of hyper progressive mentality, and it all kind of came out of that and started influencing and infusing the mentality there, which it's an interesting thing to follow.
Sure. And it seems almost like they're just operators of functioning, the society, right?
It's identity with a narrative, and they start pushing the narrative.
Yeah.
And
But
it just becomes
certain operators work well, and certain operators cause certain things to not work so well.
That's right. That's right. And so another interesting thing is like wisdom. Do you know wisdom when you hear it? How many people, almost everybody, I think that we all are kind of fascinated, aren't we, by really great wisdom quotes? We like to read quotes of this guy or quotes of this guy, and oh, it's so wise and so brilliant and everything. But one thing I have found is that, that even the people that are intrigued and love these wisdom quotes and like reading words of wisdom, they read them, they're inspired by them, then they go out and they just behave the way they do, and that speaks to the power of the conditioning of the mind and how strongly it becomes aligned with a narrative that ceases to be the thought and becomes more about the emotion connected to that thought. And so to get people to evolve past that is not easy. And I will say, meditation is great because it radiates that influence out. But if you're hanging on to a narrative and then you're meditating every day and then you're still hanging on to a narrative, it becomes a war. It's kind of like you're trying to fill the bathtub with the drain open, and so we do well to reflect on all of this humbly.
It's like the Jaimini Sutras right there.
Yeah.
On one hand, I'm freeing everything up. On the other hand, I'm white knuckling
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny.
And so how do we decide in our own life? I think we there are a lot of good things. Well, one quote that is good in this context is what Lincoln said: you can feel some of the people all the time, you can feel all the people sometimes, you can't feel all the people all the time, however that goes. And so what we're talking about here is the test of time. One of the values of tradition is that they've survived the test of time. Now, it doesn't mean that all the traditions in a culture are flawless and everything, but at least there's a leaning in that direction as opposed to a fad. I mean, fads change, every decade, if even more. You could argue now that, critical race theory is a fad. The whole transsexual thing, it's almost a fad, the stance people are taking on it. The list is long, and even the way people dress, the music people listen to, it changes from one generation, from one decade to the next. And so there is something to be said about, we could even say, narratives that have persisted through time. And depending on how deeply it's permeated a culture, pretty twisted narrative can last, 100 years or whatever. But there's also, here's the other interesting thing is grassroots. There's such a thing as grassroots wisdom, the silent majority, if you will. For example, you watch the news and, blacks versus whites, but there's so many people of color that I know, I love, and they're great. They do. A lot of them live in a very different world than I do. I mean, it's just the truth. but there's no conflict there. There's no tension there. It's a communion of different cultural norms, you see. So I remember I had an uncle who was a great guy, Uncle Sam, and he was a down to earth man, you know. Went through World War II, crossed the Remagen Bridge, you know, all like that. But I remember once we were talking. I was a teenager at the time, I think, and we were all in their dining area, their kitchen area, talking. And he made the comment. He said, every generation things change. He said, we don't know what the next generation of kids is going to do. They might just all decide to paint themselves green, you know. and so there's something to be said about the test of time, you know. What else, Scotty? I think that pretty much covers. See, that's why this thing I'm doing here with posting my notes, because every time we do a podcast, Scotty, I look back at the notes sometimes afterwards and I say, oh, I forgot that, or I forgot that. Here, there are these things that are enough to trigger your thoughts so you can reflect on it yourself and find the truth or find, I think that inspires us to reflect and ponder, you know. I remember once, what was this about? Oh, I remember, I can't remember. I don't know. I can't remember if this was in Europe or in India. But anyway, we were talking to my teacher, and and the subject of life on other planets came up, and the idea that this planet Earth is the only planet where there's life. And my teacher's comment, he says, so that sort of perspective, he says, it's just too ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, and really, so many of these perspectives that, you know, the narrative kind of takes hold for one reason or another. If you can just take a step back and look at it, you know, the emperor has no clothes. It's just too ridiculous, you know. But we've lost touch with that to a great extent, because they do have, you can justify anything with the intellect, and they do have a certain intellectual rationale that people hang on to, and that becomes their truth. That's what they become passionate about, and they don't see past it, you know. So there's a difference. See, two words. It's important to understand the distinction between is innocence and naivete. Innocence, really, in the pure sense of the word, innocence is not the same as naive. To be innocent means that there's no narrative, no bias, no indoctrination, no anything you're clinging on to, but you experience something innocently, purely for what it is, and you respond accordingly from a place deep inside, untainted by bias. Naivete is basically just oblivion. It's very different from what innocence really is, you see. So I think we kind of do this, but right now with the internet and with cable TV, the whole world, it's just a thought salad. Every time you turn around, there's another thought, another narrative being thrown at you. And what do you do? And people get so confused. And even if you talk about gun control, there's this perspective, that perspective, this point, that point. And so wisdom is about how to make a tossed salad properly, you know, how to not get lost in this narrative or that narrative. And that's what Jaimini Sutras talks about. And that's how it leads to Vedanta. And all of these things map. So Vedanta in its highest sense is a very highly evolved level of life. But there are echoes. Everything exists transgradiently, and there are echoes of that on different levels of life. It's you can call it equanimity. You can call it greater degrees of freedom from indoctrination into a narrative. And so we do well, I think, to reflect on all of this. And go from there. There's a thing I saw just recently, and I saw just to close with this whole thing about electromagnetic pulse, the electromagnetic pulse attack. Do you know about that, Scotty?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're talking about how with a strong enough electromagnetic pulse, you could compromise the power grid. And then, and so the idea is, there's concern, of course, that the Russians are creating a weapon that's the electromagnetic pulse would be so strong that would compromise the grid of the whole United States. I don't think the technology is anywhere near that.
There's also the possibility that we already have that.
Yeah, and then some would say we already have it. But regardless of whether or not it be electromagnetic pulse or something else, we would do well to protect our power grids, and that can be done. Doesn't have to be done nationally; it can be done state by state. And that's it for today, I think. Anything else, Scotty? Did I leave anything out?
No, but I was listening to that this astrophysicist guy, and he was talking about the main four elements that are in that our bodies we're made up of. I guess it's nitrogen, carbon,
right?
Um,
Hydrogen, oxygen, probably.
Yeah, okay. And then the four main elements of the universe are the same exact thing, So we're all coming out of the one thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I really don't know, but I get the point.
Yeah.
I get the point. I gave a lecture in Berkeley once.
Yeah.
And there's this guy there. I think he was on drugs or something. And he was saying, we're all star people. He kept interrupting me. We're all star people.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know why I brought that up, but I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
No.
All right.
Everybody get along and understand each other.
Yeah. So please take a look at the blog and let's get these comments going at michaelmamas.net. It's fun and it's interesting and it brings out a lot of good stuff. And I'd be like to know if you like me posting my notes for these podcasts or not. And we'll just go from there. And that's it for today. And thanks so much for listening.